talk about what makes a podcast successful. I started with a simple social media feed that I never really intended to turn into what it's become. Right now on social media, it's pretty successful, and I think that that's due to the fact that, you know, I have passion and curiosity that a lot of people respond positively to. And it's a unique form of content. I focus mostly on Los Angeles, but as you guys know, Los Angeles is a world city, and it kind of encompasses everything from, as I say, Santa Barbara to San Diego, even out to Las Vegas to a certain extent. Santa Barbara has definitely been featured in some of my LA in a Minute stuff, and mostly on my podcast, which gives me a greater platform to be able to explore instead of in the limited format of social media. On the podcast, you get a little bit less, I don't even want to use the word formality, but the area that I'm able to cover and the relationships that you make with your listeners and the informality of the medium really allows me to explore a lot of things, and it's been successful. So that's what we're going to get into, and we're going to discuss. I know people here. I've talked to some people prior to this event today. People have varying degrees of experience with their podcast. Some people are just curious. Some people just want to watch. Others have podcasts. Some have very successful podcasts. So there's different levels. And one thing to remember, there's no rules. There's no formula. That's what makes this great, what we do. And, you know, in the modern world, with all these different channels, all these different methods of communication, you know, the podcast has become a stalwart, and it's somewhere to build relationships and to kind of build your own content and your own show and your own voice. And that's something that I'm going to show how I was able to build my current following in my podcast. So without further ado, let's get into it. So why am I qualified to do this presentation first? In a Minute with Evan Levitt, I wanted to establish some bona fides of where my podcast currently is. I launched in February 2023, which is, what are we going on? About a year and a half at this point. Wow. Okay, so 18 months. I launch an episode every Friday. Today's episode was episode number 79. And to give you a little taste of the episodes, and we'll get into this later, but just to bring it up to the contemporary, today's episode was, why do the kids go back to school so early? In Los Angeles, August 12th was when LAUSD started school. And look, like, without dating myself here, the truth is I never thought about school before Labor Day, right? And so it kind of blows my mind that the kids are back in school. And it seems, you know, okay, big deal. So the kids are in school. I know some parents are actually relieved about that, right? But it seems a little interesting to me in that sense because it is so hot and it is summer. And it also costs the schools more money to run the air conditioning and all that kind of stuff. So these are the type of things that I get into on the podcast. Sometimes it's just as simple as, why are the kids back in school? And I do research and I back it up and I make it kind of conversational and dialogue driven, but you'll see more examples of the episode. Sometimes it's historical. A recent one that was popular was LA's favorite 8 road trips. And yes, Santa Barbara was on that list. It was number 4. About 2 million people from Los Angeles make the road trip to Santa Barbara every year. So they're different content, different stuff, mostly about Los Angeles. And if not Los Angeles, it has Los Angeles undertones, because that's where my listeners are used to hearing me. Currently about 7,500, at times 15,000 uniques per episode. I am very humbled by that. I know that podcasting, it's tough to develop a big audience, but we do have a loyal following. Much of that was transferred over from social media. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'm not going to lie to you guys. That was a big catalyst for me for the podcast. So I know that from a certain perspective, I did have that advantage of having a built-in social media audience. So I know that that's a thing that not everybody has, but that doesn't mean that your podcast can't be successful without it, because there's many podcasts that have started from nothing and just built. And we'll get into that. Top 5 Apple places in travel. Not quite as popular as Rick Steves, who will be part of this series down the road, and that's amazing. He's always in the number 1 slot, but still pretty good. top 250 in society and culture. Top 100 trending globally was a gift. That was something that's great. And I am able to generate revenue on the podcast. Monetization, I know, is a big concern for people who either have podcasts or who want to start podcasts. I will delve into that as well. So that's a little bit of the background there. I've had guests ranging from Jim Jeffries, the comedian from Australia, Michael Connolly. He created the Bosch and the Lincoln Lawyer characters and wrote all those novels that have been turned into TV shows. Letty and George, Power 106, photographer. A lot of people that are kind of LA culture related, and that goes with the ethos of LA in a minute, where again, celebrities, quote unquote, are nice, but they're difficult to pin down. And we'll talk about booking guests. I know that that's a major concern, but from a cultural perspective, a lot of times these sort of guests make for more compelling episodes because they're willing to share more, they're willing to dive into different forms of content that aren't as scripted, and you end up getting some good nuggets and some good clips and some good information. And of course, the big get was Mayor Karen Bass, obviously the mayor of Los Angeles, big deal. I did have to go to her. I generally like to do face-to-face in the studio, but we did that at City Hall. It's been reviewed positively. There's a couple news articles here. So, all that said, how did we get here? The social media launched it, but it still involves starting a podcast from day one, from nothing. Now, the reasons to start a podcast are as numerous as there are people in this room, you know, and people in this room have many reasons in and of themselves. For me, reach more people, different platform, it's more intimate, you get to explore more, and like I said, my format on my social media is 1 to 3, sometimes 5 minutes, usually has a historical arc. I try to put facts in there and nuggets and trivia and make it visually stimulating and change scenes every 15, 20 seconds, and boom, it's over. But the podcast really allows you to get into things that you wouldn't be able to get to in other platforms. And again, a lot of it is based around the community that you're building with the podcast and dialoguing with your listeners, and listeners building a relationship with you and you building a relationship with them, instead of just being this face on the screen that people scroll, like, comment, move on. So that really appealed to me. But again, your intentions and your reasons could be a little bit different, right? So now this is important, building the podcast, right? The most important thing, in my opinion, is finding a focus. I say area of expertise. You don't need to be an expert, but I feel that you do need to be passionate about it. I've found that passion plays as well as anything, especially in this day and age, because genuine authenticity is what people are looking for on any platform, in any walk of life at this point. And for me, my area of passion and curiosity, I won't call myself an expert, though I've done quite a bit of research, is Los Angeles. So I obviously knew that the podcast was going to be about Los Angeles. Now, being unique, I can't just be a guy that's talking about LA. Oh, I love LA. I mean, Randy Newman has a song, I love LA. Can't just play that song on repeat. So what am I going to be talking about? What is the focus? I need to think about potential audience and other podcasts in your niche, right? So just as a frame of reference, these are the general genres in podcasts, and these are the top 10 most popular: comedy, society and culture, news, true crime, sports. There's something like 110 different genres that I saw. I don't even know how you can come up with that many different genres, but they exist, and it doesn't matter whether yours is number 1 or number 110, as long as you're passionate or you have a curiosity or you have an expertise, there's going to be an audience there. And this is one thing that I want to enforce is right now, niches are popular, and that they're going to remain so because people are looking for somebody with shared interests and they want to talk about it. If you love leather chairs. You could do a podcast if you're willing to explore and you're willing to put in the work, because there's going to be other people out there and there will be a community about that. So my advice as far as starting is having that niche, that focus, and either being an expert or becoming an expert or being passionate about it and remaining focused, because I think that that's the most important element of having a successful podcast. Now, this is a very interesting slide for me. And when I saw these numbers, my eyes kind of popped out of my head, because we all know there are a ton of podcasts. I was just having a conversation before this presentation today about how many podcasts are out there. Everybody maybe knows Joe Rogan, or some of the bigger ones. If you're a basketball fan, you probably know All the Smoke and things like that. There's very big, maybe you're there's a podcast called Call Her Daddy. That's a very big, she just signed a $60 million podcast deal with Spotify. But the thing is, there are 2.7 million podcasts out there. That is a lot of podcasts, right? However, and then these next numbers show the attrition and stuff that I'm going to get into and why it's important. 494,000 active podcasts. That means they've published at least one episode in the last 90 days. So to remain, quote, active, you need to publish every 3 months. Doesn't sound that hard, but once you stop, that momentum stops, and that could be the end of that show. Because look at the last 30 days, only 121,000. I say only 121,000 because compared to that 494, that's a quarter. Only a quarter of the people that have published an episode in the last 3 months have published an episode in the last month. And then you compare to all that have ever launched, it's a tiny number. So it's a game of attrition, and this is going to apply because, again, just being consistent is a huge, huge key. You have your passion, you have your niche, and now you're being consistent with it. So those listeners begin to tune in, they begin to trust you, you begin to develop that relationship. And at the end of the day, you can succeed. Whatever it is, whatever your podcast is going to be about, just believe in that and pursue it and keep going, because these numbers, these are big numbers. You're like, oh my God, even you take that last one, 121,000, that's still so many. But that's 373,000 people that stopped publishing within the 60 days prior to that, and 2.59 million that have stopped publishing, period. So if you're doing it, you can succeed and you can keep going. And just for the record, most podcasts are 20 to 40 minutes, published every 8 to 14 days. The fact is, podcasts range from 1 minute, believe it or not, to 10 hours. So however your format is, that's your format. And that's the good thing about podcasts. There are no rules. Now, so you want to start your podcast. This is my face. This was me starting the podcast. Because you could say you want to have a podcast, and it's easy to say it. And you've heard the adage probably that anyone can have a podcast, because it's true. It's a low barrier to entry, and you can, in theory, start a podcast just with your cell phone. But the fact is, really starting a podcast takes a plan, and it takes being organized, and it's more than just having an idea. And once you sit down, you say, I'm really doing this, then the panic sets in. The fear, the insecurity, the feeling of being overwhelmed. And I remember this. When I was launching my podcast, we decided, this was in January of 2023, so January last year. I'm like, I'm doing it. We're having a podcast. Let's go. Let's expand this thing. And then all of a sudden, my next thought was, who am I? I can't have a podcast. You can't just start a podcast. I don't even know where to start. I mean, how do I do that? What are the steps? What's the equipment? How am I going to record it? How am I going to upload it? What am I going to talk about? Can I do this consistently? And all these thoughts keep going through your head, and that's normal. With anything in life, you question yourself, you feel overwhelmed, but again, if you're going to do it, do it. Because the second you take that first step, you're making progress and you're moving forward, and that's the most important part, because that first step begets the second step and the third, and before you know it, you're doing it. So just keep that in mind. If you haven't started your podcast yet, the most important thing to do to start it is to start it, okay? So that's a very, very big key. This is the fun, maybe even easy seeming part, but it's tricky because this is going to be your identity, is the title. And these are right now some of the more popular podcasts up there, right? And you got Armchair Expert, Planet Money, Call Her Daddy, Hidden Brain, Breakfast Club, H3, Joe Rogan Experience. Doesn't matter. Don't put too much stock in it. Because I remember thinking, even before the days of podcasts, right? It was like Google and Twitter, to this day. Well, not Twitter anymore, it's X. But I used to always laugh. If you would have told somebody 30 years ago that you were going to start a company and call it Twitter, people would be like, come on, like that's a silly name, like blah, blah. Google, a one with 100 zeros, what does that even mean? Doesn't matter. As long as it's yours, and as long as you're going to own it, and as long as you know that that's going to be your identity and you're going to be comfortable with it. And for me, I draw the analogy. This is why this is important. The name itself isn't important because it's going to be yours and it'll be important to you, but the show is going to determine whether people listen or not. But I always remember this back in school. You get an assignment, 10-page paper, and you're like, oh God, I don't want to do 10. Are you serious? I'm going to do 10 pages. And you wait for the last minute, night before, and you're like, I got to do a 10-page paper. And this is crazy. I'm never going to get this done. I used to do this. This is the truth. I would type out the title page, right? The history of indigenous cultures in Santa Barbara, right? Title page. And then in my head, I would be like, okay, I've started this thing. We're going. Even though that's not even one of the 10 pages, I've now started the paper. And now I have a direction because of the title page. So the title is something, you pick it, you got it, you own it, and it's going to drive your direction. So that's the first note on that. So for me, and this is something I'm doing, this is very flexible, this next part, the recording setup. I want to show you guys this, and I do know, and I want to say, TV Santa Barbara has this awesome studio right there. I'm sure you guys all walked past it. It's incredible. And it is a good turnkey solution without getting into all this stuff that I am about to get into, because I do know that it's not for everybody. But I want you to be aware that there is this great option, because this can be your testing area right here. But if you do want to do it a little bit more personal, if you don't want to have other people involved necessarily while you're just getting your feet wet, I'll show you what my setup looks like. This is our studio. So I have a courtyard office. This is where I work when I was doing my day job. Okay, this is the courtyard. This is the studio, that what became the studio, the office turned into the studio, and this is me recording, right? Simple setup, nothing crazy. The equipment's interesting. I'm gonna get into that, but like, it's just an office, and an office can be anything. It can be your office, it could be a bedroom, it can be kitchens, and I've recorded on various podcasts in different environments. Again, there's no right answer as long as the acoustics are okay. They don't even need to be excellent. Most rooms in your house are going to work for this. But I just wanted to show you guys my setup. These are other setups of podcasts that I've appeared on. Okay, this one was just an office in a warehouse. This is somebody's living room. This was at a very nice house in the Hollywood Hills. This one was at kind of a radio station. Well, it was a radio station. This was this guy's kitchen table, and this was on Zoom, right? So all these are acceptable. All these sounded great. And when you're listening to the podcast, they all sound more or less the same. So there is no, I need that. You know what I thought when I was setting up my studio? I was like, we're going to need those egg crate things that you see on the wall, and we're going to need sound this and blah, blah, blah. You don't. Like, a room in your house is going to be sufficient if you're going to record at home. Now, the equipment. And when you see this, this is a good reason to use the TV Santa Barbara studios, because the equipment, one of the first things that was ever told to me when I had decided to move forward with the podcast, there's a guy in Los Angeles who goes by the name of Ben Baller. That's his real, it's not his real name, but that's what he goes by. His name's Ben Yang. And he is the jeweler to the stars. He makes these big, gaudy, he'd be mad if I told you, if I told him that I called him God, but they're big, gaudy pieces of jewelry with diamonds and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, we have a relationship, lives in my neighborhood. He has a very successful podcast. It's called Behind the Baller. But it was big. And he says, listen, he says, Evan, he says, don't skimp on the equipment. He said, this is your one investment that's going to make or break the sound on your show, more than where you record, is the quality of the equipment. So I made the investment to get what I consider top of the line equipment, which are some of these things here. And I don't expect you to like take notes on this. And by the way, anybody wants to reach out after the show, find out what the equipment is, how much it costs. And this, I'm not saying this is the right way to do it, but I will say this. You notice the quality of the sound on professional mics, professional cords, there's an amp, an uplifter, mic stands, all that kind of stuff. Or you can use the TV Santa Barbara Studios to make sure that you're getting the momentum going at your pace. The thing that you do need to have is these recorders, right? This is the big one, this Rode Procaster. This one's fancy. You don't need anything like this. In fact, we've now upgraded to this big, fancy, cool looking, expensive one, but we still use this one right here, this Zoom, which was the first one that we ever used. And I personally recommend this, not just because it's very easy to use, it's like plug and play. I know nothing. Let me also say this too. I know nothing about electronics, technology, production, equipment. Everything I had done on social media was me and my phone. If you guys ever end up checking out Ellie in a minute, you'll see I'm like this. It's me doing the blah, blah, blah. I'm talking about Los Angeles. And I do my recording and editing on TikTok. No programs, because I didn't know anything. I'm something of a Luddite where I'm like, I don't want to get involved in all this stuff. But this is the recorder. This is the brain. This is the engine to make your podcast go. And you're going to need something like this. And another advantage of the Zoom is that it's transportable. You can carry it with you. You can take it in the field. And that's really valuable because especially now, people are doing podcasts. I think Nadine, in fact, was telling me that she does a podcast in the streets where she's interviewing people and things like that. And that's really cool. And this, by the way, when you do it in that, eliminates the need for a lot of the equipment because you're just transporting the bare minimum, and it goes to the ethos of we don't need all this. There doesn't need to be a fancy studio because going back to what I said, genuine authenticity, passion, expertise, focus, those are the things that sell. Even though good equipment is nice and it helps and it sounds good, you don't need it. This is just a guide and this is what I use. Also this, we're saying, this your memory card, that's a must. You absolutely are gonna need to have a memory card so you could upload it and record it and things like that. Okay, so you got all your equipment, you have your studio, you have your podcast title, and you're ready to go. The first thing you gotta do is test. And I was talking to Eric. He said that people have used the TV Santa Barbara Studio to do test episodes, and that is a very good idea because you wanna hear how you sound, you wanna hear how equipment sounds, you wanna hear how your format sounds. You have to test. Before you're ready to go live, prepare to do a fake episode. I think that's very important because you're gonna learn a lot from that. You don't want your first one to be the one that goes on the air. Do a walkthrough, do an interview if you're gonna have guests, get comfortable with the equipment, blah, 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 it's mandatory. So I'll tell you why testing is important. The Chris Darden episode. Have you guys ever heard of Chris Darden? He was an attorney in the O.J. Simpson case, along with Marcia Clark. He was one of the prosecutors. And he ran for judge in LA County last year. And his daughter reached out and she says, hey, we love your podcast. We think Chris Darden would be a compelling guest. He's running for judge. Would you want to have him on the show? And I was like, dude, I grew up in the OJ era. Like, absolutely would love to have Chris Darden. So what happened? We're not a video podcast yet. We've been talking about it. You're eliminating about half your audience if you're not doing video, but it adds a layer of complexity, and walk before you run is my advice. But if you want to get in the video, you can. And again, TV Santa Barbara, the studio set up, 3 cameras, the whole deal. But we had none of that. But Chris Darden was coming in, and I'd had guests, but I was like, you know what? The timing is right. Let's do a video. We're going to get the cameras. We're going to get the equipment. and we rushed it and we set it up. And by the way, when I say we, I want you guys to know, I have a partner who works at Sony, and he volunteered to help out because he was a supporter of LA in a Minute for a while. And he volunteered to help out, and we've remained in touch, and the more I grow, the more he wants to help out. And now I do give him a little bit of a stipend because he helps out a lot. And he knows his stuff. He knows a lot of this, the production stuff more than I do. But we were gonna do the video, and we're like, we have to do this. This is, for some reason, we were just locked in on this idea. Because what happened was Chris Darden was coming in on a Tuesday at 12. We finalized the setup at about Tuesday at 11:45. So we didn't test, we didn't do a run through, we were just like, live, let's go.
I mean, the cultural diversity in this city, man, you know, this is special. People say, well, I want to move to Texas, I want to move somewhere else or whatever. I don't know how you leave the culture here.
The thing is, the film quality was a little bit lower, audio quality was pretty low. It ended up being, truthfully, it was a good interview, he was a good guest, but the video was unusable. And it really kind of, I'm not gonna say broke my heart, but it was a big disappointment because we did spend a lot of money. On that day, we were like, we're doing it, we're video, and we're gonna double our audience in YouTube, and we're gonna start making money on YouTube. Now we're gonna have all these big guests because everybody went. Anyway, it was a debacle. Only one of the cameras worked. We had 3 cameras. One of them worked. One of the memory cards was corrupted. One of the other cameras I had somehow turned off accidentally like 20 minutes in. So it ended up being a single camera shoot. And the quality, for whatever reason, wasn't set at the highest level, so it looked like it was, 1994 camera, the audio was off, and it was a real humbling experience. So again, the important thing, whether you're doing video or whether you're doing audio, make sure you test beforehand. That's absolutely important and imperative. Now you're ready for your show. What kind of show are you gonna do? There's so many different types of podcasts, right? Interview, that's a popular one. Co-host, are you gonna have a co-host? That's fun. I listen to some great back and forths, and those are some of the more compelling. Storytelling, historical. I do some interviews, but I'd say the majority of my episodes are storytelling and historical because I do research and information. That's just my approach. So for me, I like to do a big script, okay? Some people don't want to hear a podcast that is being read to them. So be very careful with that. And I have people that I've helped launch their podcast, and they script and they read, and it sounds like they're reading. And it's tough to not sound like you're reading. But it's also tough to continue talking for X amount of time without having a prepared script. So what I'm saying is it's very important to do your presentation, do your preparation, do your research. And I do like to prepare a script, but it's a little loose where it's like, again, I don't expect you to read all these notes, but it's more like a bullet point format to refer to when there's a break in your monologue, you can look at, okay, that's what I'm getting into next. And I have scripted some, but the ones that I've actually scripted verbatim, I practice beforehand, I get comfortable with the reading because you want to sound natural. I think that's very important. But the fact is, your format's going to be different, and regardless of your format, the preparation, the research, and I call it the script, need to be there. But when you see script, don't think that it's a verbatim reading every word. I just want to be clear about that. Now, something that maybe I was never really told about, but you listen to podcasts, your intro and your outro, or your intro and your sign off. One thing I do on LA in a Minute, and it's kind of become like a calling card of mine, and this is on the social media, is I always start with what is up, and when I lead into the episodes, I always say, let's get into it, Okay, that's like one of my catchphrases. I can't tell you how it started, but it's become a catchphrase, right? And people sort of have come to expect that. But on the podcast, I didn't want to duplicate that exactly because I didn't want it to be a carbon copy. And as stated previously, I did want the podcast to be a more expansive version. I wanted it to be something different. I wanted the vision, even though it's Los Angeles, it's bigger than Los Angeles. So again, I do have a specific intro format. There's no corny taglines or anything, but I do have an introduction and I do have an outro, a sign off. And on the sign off, I do the basic, make sure you give me a 5-star rating, share with your friends, follow, all that kind of stuff. But whatever it is for you, whatever your approach is, make sure it's personal and know that you are going to need an intro. It doesn't need to be long. I will tell you this. If you go back and listen to my first few shows, and you don't have to, but if you do, my introduction would be like a 5-minute, somewhat rambling, hey, this is what we're going to talk about, and this is why I'm going to talk about that, and this is what inspired. And it's like 5 minutes before I'm even starting the show. And somebody had told me, like a friend, constructive criticism, like, dude, why don't you just give me a little intro and then jump into the show? Like, I'm listening. Don't bore me and turn me off before I even get into the show. So keep it brief. Have a good intro. Let people know what you're going to present, who your guest is, what your guest is about. And then when you sign off, I like to be courteous and thankful and, thank the listener, but also ask for that review. Because again, the way these algorithms work, whether it's Spotify, Apple, Overcast, Audible, the more ratings you have, the more reviews you have, the more shares you have, those all help the algorithm. And you've all heard, whether it's social media or what, the algorithm controls nearly everything. And that's fairly true. There are other aspects of getting listeners, but it can only help you when you get more of these reviews. And don't be afraid to ask. This is something too that I want to enforce. I was told this specifically because I don't love asking for stuff. It's already humbling that people are listening to the show. So I don't want to ask for something else. But you don't get it unless you ask. So make sure you ask because it is important to sustaining and growing your podcast. So make sure, if they're listening to you and they like what you're talking about, they'll give you that 5-star rating. It's very easy, little click, 5 stars, boom. So make sure you ask for that. Okay, now this is what drives mine. This is what I think is most important as both a content creator, a podcast content creator, and as a consumer. I want somebody that's prepared and that does research. I'll give you an anecdote. There's a sports talk radio host named Colin Cowherd. Maybe you've heard of him, maybe you're not. He's from Washington. He became a shooting star. He rocketed up the sports talk landscape and the podcasting landscape because he was very well prepared. And he's good at what he does and knowledgeable, but he was extremely well researched and prepared. And then somewhere along the line, things changed, and he became a guy who would be more like, instead of coming in with topics that he's discussing and bullet points that he was hitting and backing up his claims with information, he'd be more of a, so what happened in the world of sports yesterday? Let's see. And it became so much less compelling to listen to. Yes, you like the personality. Maybe you like the voice. You like his energy. But at a certain point, I'm like, I don't know, man. You're kind of taking everything for granted because you're not even doing the preparation anymore. And it was simple things that he was missing. And I don't mean to bury him, and he's actually made kind of a recovery. And I'm a fan of Colin Cowherd, so I don't want to be denigrating Colin Cowherd. But it was an example, and it stuck with me because the research. There's a guy from Santa Barbara in the same class, Jim Rome. I don't know if you guys have heard of him. He's a sports talk radio host that's actually a Santa Barbara guy, and he made his career built on research. And whatever it is, it doesn't need to be sports, again, architecture, true crime, whatever you're into. The research is the most important. So I want to show you, this is an example of a script that was an actual script of mine. This is 1 page of a 3-page script, right? So for me, if I do 3 pages, that usually is going to be about a 45-minute podcast. This was a 45-minute, but I like to do the research. I like to segment it out because I want to cover all bases of whatever the topic is of that episode. And especially in interviews, and we're going to talk about guests, but especially in interviews, you have a guest for a reason, whether it's a celebrity or whether it's your neighbor or whether it's your son or your dog. Okay, not your dog, but whoever your guest is going to be, you want to hit these points. The reason you had them in there is because you find something compelling and interesting. So you want to make sure you don't forget everything. So the notes are important. And for me, a script does help a lot, especially when I'm doing historical stuff. So research, know your topic, sound authoritative, and be authoritative. And if you're doing the podcast and you are that expert, that passionate person that's exploring and wants to have this dialogue with your listeners, you have to have the research and you have to be prepared. Again, nobody wants to listen to you just talk about football for an hour, just talk about architecture for an hour. You could talk about it and it could be interesting, but week after week, that runs out. And you can't just have that casual approach of, oh man, I'm gonna have a podcast and we're gonna just chat and people are gonna listen. It could be fun, and if that's your intention, that's cool, but if you're trying to grow and be successful, I feel that preparation, that research is paramount. Okay, so the actual nuts and bolts of recording. For me, when I started, I said, I'm going to try to have 1 episode a week, and I'm going to record on Sundays so I could edit by Tuesday, submit it by Wednesday, and launch it on Friday. And whatever your schedule is, again, there's no right or wrong schedule, but I do advise having a schedule and having a time that you're going to be able to commit to, because this keeps you accountable. You're going to know, and what it, look, I'm pretty obsessive compulsive about certain things, and when I was like, I'm going to do this every week, and I'm going to do this every week, but I was like, I'm doing it Sundays. Now I'm locked in on Sundays, so I know, and there's no excuses. Now, at this point, the schedule changes, and life changes, and stuff happens, and your wife's family has events, or you're traveling, or emergencies come up, so you're not going to have that Sunday. But once you commit, and try your best to have a consistent day, a consistent time, because that will turn into your routine, and that makes it a lot more, not easy, but accessible to you to be able to execute that, because you know in advance, you're like, all right, podcast coming up Sunday, Wednesday, Thursday, I'm going to start my research script and blah, blah, blah. So you help build this schedule and this routine. I think that that's important. Before each episode, relax. That's a tough one. That's a real tough one, especially for people who are tightly wound or have anxiety. For me, and I'll be transparent, I like to have a glass of wine beforehand. Whatever your relaxation is, meditation, taking a walk, taking a nap, whatever it is, relax. You want to sound natural. You want to sound comfortable. You don't want to sound nervous. You don't want to sound rushed. So whatever it takes for you to relax. Batteries, plugs, all that stuff. Background noise. Background noise is interesting. I talked about Nadine, and again, but she brought up some good points. So being on the streets and interviewing people, background noise is actually appealing. Because if I do an interview with this gentleman right here, and we're out on State Street, it's a different type of interview if I'm interviewing him in my studio versus interviewing him out there. But if I'm like, oh, I'm out here on State Street, you want to kind of hear that action. You kind of want, but if you're in the studio and you're being serious and it's your podcast and it's a certain kind of podcast, remember that your equipment will pick up background noise. And depending on the show, it could work. My wife listens to a show, I forget the name of it, but it's 2 sisters, Aaron and Sarah Foster. I forget what it's called. I think it's called the First Podcast in the World or something like that. That's a good show. But they're intentionally casual, where you'll hear their kid, you'll hear their dog, you'll hear them clanging some dishes, and it's endearing because they're, one of them is a bona fide celebrity, the other one's married to a professional tennis player, so it's a different type of show, and it's kind of like an insight into their life. But for me, when I'm like, hey, I'm bringing the history and the facts and the expertise on this topic, you don't want to hear the air conditioner running in the background. And I use the air conditioner because one of our first episodes in my office, the air conditioner was running. And when we were playing it back, we couldn't figure out what is that background noise? Because it's not going to sound super loud, but it's enough that you can hear it. And we're like, what is that? What is that? We're like, oh my God, it's the air. But your equipment will pick that up. So just be aware of that. It's imperative for certain kind of shows. Other ones, it's not as important. But just be aware that if you have the type of show where background noise would interfere or would be distracting, eliminate that background noise. Don't be afraid to use notes. Don't be afraid to use your script. I mean, this is the beauty of having a podcast, is it's just you or you and a guest or you and your co-host. But the vibe of a podcast is inherently casual, and you don't want to run into dead air. That's, you know, whether it's TV or radio or a podcast, you don't want somebody to just hear nothing for 5 seconds because he couldn't think of anything. So have your notes, whatever that is for you. Maybe you print them out. Maybe you handwrite them. Maybe you use your computer. Maybe you use a PowerPoint slide. Either way, have your notes ready and don't be afraid to use them. And you can always, always edit. By the way, this is my son and my nephew. Just wanted to include them. My nephew actually wants to have a podcast, so I've had him in there a couple times to work on that. Editing. This is a little bit out of my wheelhouse. I'm going to be honest with you guys. Like I said, I'm very thankful that my partner Kay does a lot of the legwork on this, but he was nice enough to share Mac and PC, Adobe Audition, if anybody's taking notes, free trial that you can use it, test it. And I will say this, the programs now are all very intuitive. The way technology's advanced, the way cell phones are, and the way they just want mass adoption, all this stuff is intuitive. It's going to be intimidating at first because everything is, but remember that like 11-year-old kids are using this stuff, and if they can figure it out, I promise you can figure it out. The one we do use, even though Adobe Audition, I include that because that is a free trial, we use LumaFusion. That is this purple one and this one on top. This is Adobe Audition, looks like this. Again, if that intimidates you, it intimidates me, so that's okay. But they're easy to use because all you do is you just read, they'll tell you what to do, volume, track, stuff like that. Or you could outsource, you could use TV Santa Barbara, but it's whatever you're comfortable with for the editing. But there's so many different programs out there. These are the two that we kind of stand behind and that I've seen used and that I know are fairly easy to use. Uploading your podcast. You have a podcast, you record it, you edit it, you're good to go. It's not really a podcast until it's published. How do you publish this podcast? You have to have a hosting service. And again, there's no right one, there's no wrong one. I wish I could tell you, yo, make sure you use this one because it's the best. These are just the most popular ones right here, okay? Buzzsprout is pretty darn good, 90-day free trial. Spotify now has made a big push. Spotify, if I'm not mistaken, purchased Anchor. Anchor used to be a big dog, but I think Spotify purchased it because in doing the research on this, Anchor now turns into Spotify Premium. So I think that's it. And that's a good inroad into Spotify because, and I don't want to cut ahead, but this is the breakdown, just FYI. Podcast players by market share. You see this, the top one, mostly Apple Podcasts, more than half. That Spotify is a little underrated. I've seen different numbers on this. The podcast metrics are a little bit inexact. I think it's kind of equivalent to TV ratings, to Nielsen, where there's a guidepost, but it doesn't mean that's the exact number of TVs that are tuned in. That's not the exact number of podcasts. But the thing you got to remember, Apple is the big dog. Spotify is next, but there's so many different ones, so many different apps, Overcast, Audible, all this stuff. Mine's right here, by the way. This is mine. 75% Apple, about 10% Spotify, 7% Overcast, 6% others. So mine's pretty simple. But just so you know, when you have Spotify and you use Anchor, Spotify Premium, it's going to get you into that Spotify, and the algorithm favors that. So If you or people you know use Spotify more, and I know a lot of people that do use Spotify, that's a good one, but it's just a suggestion. There's so many different ones, and none of them, I'm not gonna say none of them, but none of the big ones are gonna be terrible. Take a night, research, sign up. Most of them have free trials. Just see which one is most appealing to you. What's the easiest to use for you? Because we're all different, right? Sometimes somebody's gonna want a colorful one, or somebody wants one that looks like Apple and is smooth. Somebody might be, you know, a little bit more technically savvy and one that has more bells and whistles and stuff. So whatever's more comfortable for you. Once you upload it, you get an RSS link. The RSS link lets you post it to the different podcast directories. So you could submit it, Apple, Spotify. Don't worry about every single one right off the bat. You don't, hopefully you're fortunate enough that the podcast gains a following. You want to be on every platform. But when you're first starting, just get on Apple, maybe get on Spotify. Those are going to be the two big ones, and that'll be more than enough. Rarely do I have somebody say like, yo, how come your podcast isn't on Bluebird or whatever? Sorry, it's not. Can you go to Apple or Spotify? Most people have those. So that's basically the process of getting that started and getting that uploaded. This is huge. This is another one I learned the hard way. Music. You can't use any, in short, you can't use any music without an explicit license, explicit permission, explicit copyright. They are very, very particular, and you will get dinged. They will pull your episode. They will pull you down. There are services. We have a neighbor on our street that runs one of those services, and again, I don't have the technical vocabulary, but it crawls the internet looking for people, looking for podcasts and videos that have used music without permission, and it'll penalize them, if you will. And he's like, yeah, I'm that a-hole, right? Like, but that's their job, and that's how the market works. So be very careful with music. Your favorite song, I did an episode, and it was a dang good episode. It was called The 5 Songs That Define Los Angeles. And man, I was so excited about it because there's so many good LA songs. I mean, again, the obvious ones, I Love LA. I didn't even include that. That was like a bonus one because that was too obvious. But Red Hot Chili Peppers, Under the Bridge, Welcome to the Jungle, Guns N' Roses. That's about Axl Rose getting off the bus in Los Angeles. Like, whoa, it's the jungle. And I was so, and look, if you guys are from that era, you understand how like the beginning of Welcome to the Jungle is not just so recognizable, but it like gives you chills and gets you excited. I was like, dude, I'm gonna start the episode with this. This is gonna be crazy. I'm gonna get all these songs on here. Everybody loves music. Everybody loves all these LA songs. Even if they don't know that they come from LA, now they're gonna know that these songs come from LA and they're about LA. So I uploaded it, and then within about 20 minutes, I got a call, and it's like, hey, you got to take this episode. It wasn't a call, it was an email. The episode needs to come down. It's like, what do you mean? Like, this is great. This is going to be my biggest episode ever. This is going to be a great one. I'm so excited. Can't use any of that music. So just be aware of that. But you can get permission for certain songs, which I actually have been able to. Certain artists actually have different, there's databases that you can like apply for permission or pay for permission, stuff like that. That costs a lot of money. But there's also these royalty-free music sites, or you can make your own. So just search royalty-free music. And in fact, for us, we actually have our own music for the podcast that came from one of these services. So but our podcast does have music, and there's a song that we got from one of these royalty-free services. So keep that in mind. Even if it's a snippet, even if you're pulling video that has a song in the background, this technology is so sensitive that it will find your music, and it won't just silence that part. It'll take down the whole episode. So I wanted to make a separate slide about that because that's very, very important about not using music without permission. Okay, booking guests. This one's a fun one. It's a frustrating one. It's an overwhelming one at times, and it's very important because a lot of people want to hear guests on the podcast. You want to have guests on your podcast. Now, obviously, if you're booking your neighbor or, a professor that may be a little bit, that you have a relationship, those are a little bit easier to get. And you know what? I want to state something that's funny. I noticed this with Joe Rogan. I'm not a huge, Joe Rogan fan, but I respect what he's been able to accomplish. And I do note that his more compelling episodes tend to be with guests that I've never heard of. So I want you to keep that in mind, in the sense that some of the most interesting episodes you might be able to have are with people that are interesting, because you as an interviewer are going to be able to bring that stuff out of them, rather than a big name. Oh, I want to interview celebrities. I want George Clooney to come on the podcast, and things like that. But you can get those people on the podcast. And the guests that I've had, including Mayor Karen Bass, what it is you be honest and transparent. I'm Evan Lovett. I have a podcast, In a Minute with Evan Lovett. We have this many listeners. I want to interview you about this and include this. And they're probably going to say no, okay? If without any established foundation, why would somebody go on your podcast? But guess what? A no just means not right now. And if you get a response, that's actually a positive thing, because now you have that contact info. And when you build your reputation, you build your show, and you get more experience, you could come back to them, because in 3 months, 6 months, a year, they could be having a better day, they could be in a better mood, or they may have heard your show or heard about your show throughout the grapevine. So persistency is key, but being honest and transparent about who it is, who you are, and why they will be of value to your show is probably the most important thing. And again, don't be afraid, because I've been rejected 100+ times. I've had people say yes and then cancel. Right now, I'm working on Mario Lopez. I don't know if you guys know who Mario Lopez is. He was on Saved by the Bell. He does Access Hollywood, a couple other things. But we've been in contact, and he's always given me these soft commitments, and then he pulls out. But I'm like, you know what? When the timing's right, he's going to do the show, and I'll be there. And I check in every couple months. And sometimes he's like, yeah, let's do it. Oh, I can't. But if somebody rejects you, you know what? Especially now, it's not like, hitting on somebody at a bar where you have to be embarrassed about it. It's an email or a DM, and they say no, and then you move on, and then you go to the next person, because it's a limitless amount of people that are out there. And for whatever your show is, they're going to be compelling, interesting people. And don't be afraid to start with somebody more accessible and work your way up, because here's the thing. Your first interview isn't going to be a spectacular interview. You're going to have to improve your interviewing skills and work your way up. And the more guests you get, the more likely it is that somebody on the next rung and the next rung and the next rung will say yes. So let's say somebody does say yes. What do? Roll out the red carpet. Make them feel comfortable. Give them every piece of information they're going to need. Here's the time. Here's the location. Here's where you park. I'm going to have a full refrigerator of drinks. I'm going to have snacks. I'm going to make it as easy and thoughtless of them to make it happen and make them as comfortable as they can be in my environment, in my studio. And now, just jumping ahead a little bit, this is a preference of mine, okay? I really, really think it's important to do the interviews in person. Though Zoom works, and for some people, there are, it's impossible. If you're interviewing somebody in New York, you're not going to fly them out to appear on the podcast, at least not, until you get very big with the podcast. But if it is possible, try to have them come to you, or take your Zoom recorder, the one I showed you earlier, the portable one, and go to them. Mayor Karen Bass, I went to City Hall to do that episode. And again, you're a little bit out of your element, but you still have your mic, you have your recorder, you can bring your headphones, you can strip down the equipment that you need and go to them. But I really think that personal is more intimate, and that listeners can hear that and they can feel that. And I think it's very important. Not to say that the Zoom and video interviews can't work and can't be successful, because I've watched many podcasts where it's, and listen to podcasts where it's a Zoom but you can tell the difference. So I really, really push for the in-person, and I've had people say that I can do it over video, but I won't do it in person, and I've turned those down, but that's just a personal preference. It doesn't mean it's wrong, but I do think there's an intimacy and a personal connection of having somebody there in person. So if you can, I think that that's more beneficial. Do your homework, be prepared, have all the questions you want to ask, all the bullet points that you're going to want to know, and make it fun. Make sure the guest has fun. You could be nervous. I've been nervous for all my guests. Like I think it's just, unless you're Eric, you get nervous when you're speaking to somebody important and somebody big time, or even just somebody that's just a guest. I mean, it's human nature. But make it fun, let them relax, and part of that's rolling out the red carpet. And just know once it starts, you're going to feel more comfortable, they're going to feel more comfortable. But the way you feel most comfortable is by being prepared, knowing where you're going to take the interview, what you want to accomplish, some kind of arc on how you're going to like approach it, where you're going to go, and how you're going to wrap it up. When I did Michael Connolly, the creator of Bosch and Lincoln Lawyer, I'm a reader. I'm not a big TV guy, but I know that Bosch and Lincoln Lawyer were very successful and are very successful streaming shows. So I was like, here's what I want to do. I focus on origin stories. I wanted to get his background. What made him become a true crime writer, and why Los Angeles? He's not even from Los Angeles. Why does he write Los Angeles? So I knew what I wanted to cover. How did that turn into a show? And I wasn't going to lie. I wasn't going to be like, oh, I watch all these episodes, because I don't. I read the books. But I know that the TV is important, so I wanted to cover that, but I was transparent about it. Like, how are the shows different? How do you prepare? But I had this arc, so the way I laid it out was like origin story, how he became a writer, talk to me about the TV stuff, and then talk to me about your relationship with Los Angeles and where that's all going to go. So I knew ahead of time where I wanted to take the interview, and you can't get to every question. I mean, at least with the question, it would be a 3-hour interview. So know which ones are more important and let the conversation flow naturally. If I'm talking about his origin story and it naturally goes into the TV stuff, I don't necessarily want to be like, oh wait, I still have these other questions from this section, because you do want him to be comfortable and you want it to seem natural, because for your listeners and for you, it just flows a lot better. This is my wife, by the way. And the reason I bring this up is because she actually was a guest on one episode of the podcast, and it was even after certain bigger guests, and I wanted to include her because it's very important to know that, again, not all your guests need to be your big names. This was one of my bigger episodes, like the one that I have my wife on, because it does give people kind of an inside look into who I am, and you know, she gives some insights that maybe I wouldn't necessarily share on the show, but this was the easiest guest ever to book. So what I'm saying is, don't be afraid to like ask your son, your husband, your neighbor, because those can be some of the most fun listening experiences, and for you, you're probably going to be more comfortable and it'll be a better interview. So just keep that in mind. Shooting for the stars is awesome, and do it, and you know, don't prepare to be rejected and don't be afraid to be rejected, but also like your best guest might be sitting next to you right now. So just keep that in mind. I forgot to mention that. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that. This for me is huge. Consistency is king. Like I said, I have a little bit of OCD, and I got to get it done. I just have that in me where I'm like, we're getting this done no matter what. I'll sacrifice sleep. I'll sacrifice eating sometimes, not too often eating, but I want to get it done, and I want to produce it because I know that once you start developing that relationship with your listeners, once the momentum starts going in a positive direction, you don't want to have people waiting and waiting. And it doesn't mean, look, for me, I do an episode every week. 79 episodes in a year and a half. I've missed 2 weeks. And even on those 2 weeks, I ran reruns. So for me, I want my listeners to know that my episode's coming out every Friday. I know it's hard to keep up with. Not every listener is going to listen to every episode, not by any means. But I want them to know that if it's a Friday and they're like, oh, cool, In a Minute with Evan Lovett's coming out, they're going to see that episode come out. So consistency will, again, help you just stay focused. If you're really going to do it, keep doing it because it becomes easier, it becomes more in your wheelhouse, and it just helps your product grow. And I'll tell you this, the algorithms respect the consistency. If they see you pushing it out every week, they'll start to give you more organic, not every week, whatever every week, bi-weekly, monthly, whatever it is, they're going to give you more organic visibility because they see that consistency rather than somebody that posts haphazardly. There's a really good podcaster in LA. He's called Hidden History of Los Angeles, but he's an attorney and he's a city attorney and he works a lot. And he posts an episode here, an episode there, and his show is awesome. But he can't get any traction because he'll do 2 in a row and then none for 3 months, and then one on Friday and one on Monday, and then none for 4 months. And it's okay if you're doing the podcasting for you, which, you know, in theory you should be, but he also laments the fact that he doesn't have that growth and that organic way to build the show. And I'm like, dude, you have to have the consistency, whatever that means for your format. For me, it's every week, but if it's every month, then do it every month because consistency really, really does help you grow. Okay, engagement. This is huge. You can't have a successful podcast without some kind of engagement. You're building a community. Your podcast is about your community. Again, going back to if you love leather chairs, now you got a leather chair community, but guess what? You're all bonded. That's a serious bond because everybody's like, man, we're these people that love these leather chairs. That's awesome. And now you have this close-knit community and you're having that dialogue on the show. What do you think? How do you feel about this? What are your thoughts? Should I get a leather chair in this teal color? You know, blah, blah, blah. And invite the feedback, whether it's email or on your social media or whatever the case may be. Have polls, contests, giveaways. I happen to be on all social media platforms. I'll get into that in the marketing section. But there's different ways that you can communicate with your audience because even though the podcast is necessarily pre-recorded most often, what I've done is I've said, hey, shoot me a note, whether it's DM, email, comment, and I'll read the best comments on my next episode. Or I've had segments in my show which were just questions from listeners, and that gets a lot of engagement and that builds it. And now people get to hear their name. Shay from Santa Barbara asked, when are you going to talk about the Lakers on the podcast? All right, Shay, well, I'm going to talk about it because, in 3 episodes. But people like to hear that, and they want to be included, and they want to be recognized. So remember, even though it's a one-way street, kind of, with your podcast, it's still a dialogue. And keep your listeners in mind because that's very important, especially spotlighting listeners. Social media is huge. It's a necessary evil. My kid is 10. I don't even know what I'm going to do when he starts opening his social media accounts. But that's beside the point for me and my podcast and for you and your podcast, because social media is an extremely valuable tool for getting exposure, for getting distribution, and communicating to your listeners, which is really, really an important part of keeping people engaged and looking out for the next episode. Now, this is a big one. Collaborate with listeners who have good ideas and capability. Mike Knox, that's the guy in the picture. This guy wrote me an email out of the blue. He says to me, hey, I have a good idea for your, he's like, I like your podcast, blah, 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 Los Angeles. I have a good idea for a show. He said, I used to work at a Supermax prison in Lancaster. Lancaster is part of Los Angeles County. And he said, I was a guard there for 5 years, and I have some really good stories. And at first, I was like, I didn't even know LA had a Supermax prison. I did know that if the slide that true crime is a very, very popular genre of any kind of entertainment, but especially for podcasts. I think it's number 2 most popular podcast genre. Might be number 3. But I was like, wow, I would have never thought of that. And now getting those stories on the inside. So I said, come on, here's a guest basically asking to book himself. And now I had to verify that he really was who he said he was, because you don't want to be kind of caught in that regard. But that ended up being, again, one of the more popular episodes. And it was because of a listener who literally was like, yo, let's talk about this. So that was a great idea. So listen to your listeners as you're dialoguing with them, because they have good ideas. And when they're included, that could be some of your best work. So keep that in mind. That's important. And again, I want to reiterate, don't be afraid to ask for reviews, ratings, and to share, because that is really, really important to keep your podcast growing. And a thing too, for people that I've talked to or that I've helped launch their podcasts, don't be afraid to annoy your friends and family. And I know that that's like kind of sensitive territory for some people. My wife would be horrified. She's the person who's like, doesn't like asking for favor. But man, those are the people that are close. And listen, I'll tell you this, after a while, it's definitely gonna grate on them, be annoying. But at first, those are the people that are gonna build your numbers. And it's really important to get those first 5-star ratings. Even if it's you have a 5-star rating from 5 ratings. That's great, because it's better than 0. Even if it's your mom, your son, your sister, your coworker, the 5 stars is 5 stars. So don't be afraid to ask the people closest to you. You'll feel like you're bugging them, but they'll do you the favor. And that's how you're gonna get the ball rolling. And again, you know how people are. Once they see a show building and getting, oh my God, she has 22 ratings now. Seems more popular. Now they're going to give it that listen. That's just human nature. So don't be afraid to ask the people you know. You won't be bugging them, at least not right off the bat. Marketing. This is tough. I have every social media possible, Threads, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. I don't use Facebook probably as much as I should, but that's a personal preference. LinkedIn, for you professionals out there, but they're all very good and free marketing channels, okay? You don't need to pay, you can down the road, pay for advertising distribution, but you already have even if you have 21 followers on Twitter, tweet it out there. And this was the 8 road trips one, right? So I kind of have like the same approach. What I do is I put together a video, even though the podcast isn't video, I put together a video of like what I'm going to be talking about with like the image spine and stuff like that. And be concise, include the link, talk about why people should listen, why it's compelling, and put it out there. Because even if people scroll and they're, oh, tweet, I don't want to listen. Guess what? You have 22 followers. One of them listens to the podcast. That's one more listener than you had before you put that tweet out. And every one counts. Don't forget, did I show this? Oh my God, I passed over a very valuable, check this out. I want to show you guys something. This is super, super important to remember when you're gauging your podcast success. Look at this chart right here. The top 1%, oh my God, top 1% must be such a great podcaster. 5,000, not even 5,000 downloads. And again, 5,000 sounds like a lot, but then when you're like, wait a minute, if I get 5,000 downloads, I'm in the top 1%. Look at this. If you get 29 downloads, this is the median. The average podcast has 29 listens. So the podcast world is very intimate. Even though it's big, it's a lot easier to stand out than it seems, because look, if you're getting 29 people listen, you probably know 29 people that you can text. I text my friends. I'm literally like, if they're into this episode, I'll text them and be like, dude, you got to listen to this. 29, you're already in the top half. If you get more than 29 downloads, to be in the top 10%, you only need 472 downloads. So it really is, and I know these numbers starting from 0, you're like, oh, well, I got to get to 1 before I can get to 472. But look at that, like it's not a huge level to get to advance into these different echelons. And before you know it, you can start monetizing after you're doing that marketing. So let's talk about that for a sec. Monetization. Okay, this is the big one. With very few exceptions, you can't monetize on day 1. You're just not gonna, not even day 100. But you can build, and the more you build, again, first you get that 29 download mark, you're at 50%. Then you get the 472 download mark, and you're in 10%. And then before you know it, you're at 1,000 downloads, and 1,000 may not seem like a lot. But in the podcast world, that's worth a lot. because the relationships that you're building through the podcast are different than almost any form of media. You have a captive, intimate audience that is listening to your every word. And advertisers know this. And right now, again, I just mentioned that Alex Cooper, call her daddy, just signed a $60 million contract with Spotify. And now that's obviously the outlier, and she has a crazy popular podcast. But there is a lot of money in the podcast space, and with good reason, because advertisers know that even with a small amount of listeners, now all of a sudden, those people are engaged, they trust you, and then when you're advertising whatever it is, they're going to realize that you would not have taken on that kind of advertisement if it wasn't relevant to what you're doing, right? So again, chairs, your podcast, I keep going this, but your podcast about chairs, now you got a furniture store. You have 1,000 listeners. Well, it's like, oh my God, guess what? This furniture store down State Street has these teal leather chairs. I want to advertise on that podcast. And this is real. This is what happens. Like for me, one of my first advertisers was a Chinese bakery called Kiwa Bakery. They have 4 locations in Los Angeles, and they sell these things called mooncakes, which symbolize the summer harvest festival. And they're really cool. They're delicious and blah, blah. But they were like, we know you have a dedicated Los Angeles following. You talk about history. You talk about tradition. You talk about culture. We think you'd be a good fit. And it's, again, nobody really heard of it, but shoot, an advertiser, of course. I'd come on board. Let's do it. And I say up here, competitive rates based on audience size. How do you know it's competitive? It's tough to tell. But basically, whatever you're going to be comfortable accepting is a good rate, and that'll be your starting point. You could do research. I'll share, what my rates are. If anybody wants to know, I could share all this information. I'm transparent. But there is an advertiser for your show, because what you're going to be speaking about is a niche, and you're going to have an engaged audience, and you're going to have an audience that trusts you and that's intimate, right? So for me, local businesses are number one. Businesses that are germane to whatever you're talking about. When I say local, I don't mean physically. If you have a Santa Barbara-based podcast, then yes, Santa Barbara business. But I mean local, meaning relevant to whatever you're talking about. You can approach them. This is a little bit different, but if you put together a media kit, you can be like, this would be a perfect advertiser for the show. Send them the media kit. That's a little bit of work. I could coach you through that. That's a little bit too in the weeds for this presentation. But that's work, that's something that's successful. Merch is always a good idea. Anybody that supports your podcast and they're listening to every episode, they're gonna buy something to support you. And again, don't be afraid to ask. We have shirts, we have hats. During the holiday season, I had mugs, I had phone cases, and there's stuff, I didn't need to spend any money to make these things. There's sites now like Teespring or Merch Labs that, as long as you have your logo, they'll print and ship the product and build the store for you, so you don't even need to spend any money to have the merch. You're not gonna make as much as you would if you were gonna buy it, but I don't wanna have inventory. I don't wanna have 1,000 shirts and hope I sell them all. So you can have merch, and it's incremental revenue and just getting paid. When you sell that first shirt, when you sell that first hat, you're gonna be so proud of yourself that somebody's wearing your logo around town, and you get a little money on it. Patreon. Don't know if you guys have heard of Patreon, but it's basically like a support me platform. That's a little bit of an ask. But again, if your content is good and people are listening, they'll be willing to pay. Speaking engagements is another one. It's got to be relevant to what you're doing, but approach somebody. Show what your value is. Tell what your value is. And this is when you're building listeners and you have that consistency, you have a value, because again, podcasts not only are in vogue, but the relationship that you have with the consumer, with the listener, is so much more valuable than almost any other platform right now. So don't forget that, and know that small number, what you may think is a small number, is worth something. It's worth something to these advertisers. This premium content, bonus episodes, behind the scenes, early access, that's all fun. I don't do any of that stuff, but some of the podcasts I follow do that stuff. And honestly, I paid for it before because sometimes you're just so into a creator or podcast host that you're like, dude, let's do it. I'll pay for that. This for me, most played episodes. Funny enough, Apple is the only one that gives me the exact numbers. I get an aggregate every week, but Apple's the only one that breaks it down. But again, these are the major platforms, school episodes, some guests, the songs one I did end up re-releasing, restaurants, crime, but all my stuff within Los Angeles. It's just fun. I keep it varied. I try to keep the content different episode to episode, but still staying true to what In a Minute with Evan Lovett is. So just know that the different platforms have different metrics, and Apple's where you're going to get your most stats. So that for now is the conclusion of the presentation. I want to thank you and just remind you the big keys: preparation, knowing your voice, knowing your direction, being consistent, and having fun. Because if you're not doing this to have fun, then why are you doing it really? Like, whether it's a hobby, whether it's a passion, whether it's something that's gonna be a profession, you have to do it because you enjoy it and you wanna feel proud of yourself, you wanna feel that you accomplished something, and you wanna feel that you're putting something out there, for me at least, as a legacy, as something that my son, you know, when he grows up, can go back and listen to these, or something that my parents would be proud of, or something that I can look back on, like my top songs episode. You know, I'm very excited about that one, or back to school. But you're doing it, and make sure you have fun, because that's what it's about ultimately. And hopefully today I was able to give you some keys to get started or jumpstart where you're at in your podcast experience right now. But I think ultimately preparation is big, focus, and fun. So thank you guys all for being here. Really, it was a privilege. Eric, TV Santa Barbara, appreciate everybody. And yeah, thank you everybody for showing up. I really appreciate it.